restores funding so their children can eat. For more, I'm very pleased to welcome to the show Congresswoman Karen Bass, representing California's 37th District. Congresswoman, welcome to Viewpoint.
Thanks for having me on again.
Thank you, of course. What a pleasure. Now, let's start with the Trayvon Martin case, if we may. You've been posting news stories about the protests on your website, and it looks like the protests will go on, with the Reverend Al Sharpton now calling for a 100-city rally this weekend. Congresswoman, what do you hope will come out of these protests? And realistically, what could one expect to come from these protests?
Well, first of all, you mentioned the 13 people that were arrested. The protest last night in Los Angeles took place in my congressional district, and 13 young people were arrested. Many of them were minors, and that breaks my heart because, frankly, we do not need to have any more young African Americans and Latinos incarcerated. And so I certainly hope that as the protests continue, that the protests be peaceful. You know, 1992, the young people that were arrested yesterday were not even born and don't realize the violence that took place and how parts of our community still remain with vacant lots because building hasn't taken place. But you asked what I hope will come of it. I think when you have a crisis like this, when you have an outpouring of outrage and grief, frankly, at the injustice of the verdicts, that you can take this energy and you can channel it in a very positive way. For example, there needs to be a national movement to repeal the stand your ground laws. I understand that that didn't specifically come up in the case, but you know that it really set a context for this case. And frankly, when those verdicts happened, it hurt my heart because I just felt like now it can be open season on black youth. To me, I'm not a lawyer, I have to admit that, but I don't understand why George Zimmerman got out of his car to begin with. I don't see how you could call the situation equal, and I don't think that Trayvon Martin was a young man. Trayvon Martin was a teenager. He was barely 17. He wasn't even old enough to vote. And so the idea that somebody can be afraid and then get out of their car and confront the person that they're afraid, if he had stayed in his car and driven away, Trayvon Martin would be alive today.
Exactly right. And of course, if Trayvon Martin had been Caucasian, as we all know, Mr. Zimmerman would never have called 911 or gotten out of his car in the first place.
You know, I was deeply insulted by the defense attorney that said that if the races were reversed, that there never would have been an arrest. And history and no data documents that. Anytime there is a quote-unquote crime of an African-American against a white person, it's very clear how quickly the justice system acts.
Indeed, and again, it's worth pointing out that for many, the real victory of the case came that this man was actually arrested and brought to trial in the first place after 6 weeks of inaction. But I want to move on to what's happening now, because as you know, Congresswoman, Reverend Sharpton is one of many calling for federal civil rights charges to be filed against George Zimmerman. The Justice Department says it's investigating, but most observers say charges are unlikely. Do you think, Congresswoman, there's a legal issue to be pursued here, or is it more of a moral issue here that the whole country needs to pursue?
Well, I absolutely think it's both. And the moral issue, in a way, I think is even more important. You know, I've watched the feedback, the emails that some reporters have received who are African American in response to some of the things that they've posted. And it's just absolutely frightening. The hate that this has opened up. It's a very scary situation. And so I think the moral issue is important. I do hope the Justice Department files charges. And I also hope the family files charges, makes a civil case out of it. I think that whatever can be done within the legal system, we need to push it to the maximum.
You're exactly right. And you should see, Congresswoman, some of the comments that this show has gotten from what we've posted on Viewpoint. It's pretty amazing. I never imagined so many right-wingers defending a guy who had once been arrested for assaulting a cop. But in a speech today before the NAACP, Attorney General Holder criticized the Stand Your Ground laws, which he said allow and perhaps encourage violent situations to escalate in public. And as you know, more than 30 states have now passed these laws. Stand Your Ground wasn't officially part part of Zimmerman's defense, although at least one juror seemed to think it played a role. Do you think all those laws should be rescinded throughout the country?
Oh, I absolutely do. Could you imagine if Trayvon Martin had stood his ground and shot George Zimmerman? I mean, the idea that we would have laws like that. I do have to say that, in California, we would never have stand your ground laws. But those states that do have them, in a time when we are looking at gun violence and gun safety, all of that needs to be rolled into one. And I think stand your ground laws need to be repealed across the board, across the country.
It's a bit mystifying that the prosecution never tried to argue that Trayvon Martin was standing his ground against the man stalking him.
Exactly.
Well, let's turn to food stamps, an equally tragic story now.
It is.
Are you encouraged that Senator Stabenow wants to go to conference, and do you think that the Senate would approve a bill that didn't restore funding to SNAP?
I really don't believe the Senate would restore a bill. But you know what? It's very similar to the budget. My Republican colleagues passed this crazy legislation, and then they really don't want to go to conference because technically we should be in conference around the budget. So I will be very curious to see if they actually go to budget over the farm bill. They have said that they were going to pass food stamps separately, but if they are going to do what they did a couple of weeks ago and pass food stamps where people who have food stamps, people who are hungry, have to have drug testing, have to have work requirements attached to it, as though they're not working already. Tens of thousands of people that are on food stamps are poor working Americans. I think that the problem here is that a lot of my Republican colleagues cannot accept that hunger exists in America with people who are not criminals, but people who are hungry and cannot work enough in order to supply food for their families for a month.
Indeed, and of course those struggling Americans tend to be concentrated in red states, and yet it seems like these congressmen know that this will never happen, that the president will never sign a bill. Was this just theater? Was just this them putting on a big act of saying we're going on record as saying we don't care about Americans who are suffering right now?
Well, I think it was two things, and I just think it is very consistent and classic. In passing the farm bill, they did pass subsidies, which are essentially handouts of government money to people who, in some cases, are already millionaires in the form of farm subsidies. I think it's consistent with the 1%, the 47%, however you want to look at it. That is their priority. That is their focus. It's not on 100% of the United States. Because if you were concerned about 100%, you would be deeply ashamed that the richest country on the planet in the history of the world cannot feed its population?
And while they can't, you're exactly right, Congresswoman. They're giving away subsidies for peanut, cotton, and rice farmers, fruit and vegetable growers, and restoring insurance programs for livestock ranchers. In other words, the party of Mitt Romney giving out free stuff.
Exactly.
Now, you criticized Republicans last month for the sequester, which, as you know, cut about $85 billion from this year's federal budget. So how has the sequester impacted your district in California?
Well, actually, I'll give you a couple of very specific examples. When the sequester was passed, I went to a clinic that was going to have to reduce the patients that they service. 3,000 families were going to be knocked off of the rolls of this one community clinic because of funding cuts. I also went to an Air Force base where the civilian workforce was going to experience furloughs. So it is having a direct impact. And then I learned about another impact that doesn't impact my district per se, but is deeply troubling. Did you know that Indian reservations, Native American reservations were not protected in the sequester?
Indeed,
and so some poverty programs were protected, but Native American reservations were not protected. Once again, that is a scandal. Really is. It's very sad.
Indeed, arguably the lowest economic rung in American society with very little representation in Congress, and yet we don't hear any complaints from our GOP friends about that suffering.
Exactly. I do have to say that the one Native American member of Congress is a Republican, and he is very concerned about this, Tom Cole. I talked to him the other night, and he definitely wants to see that change. But we need to cancel the sequester completely, not in a piecemeal fashion.
Well, I got to say, our Republican friends in the Congress are doing something very important for America's future. As you know, they're going to vote this week to delay part of Obamacare from taking effect in the majority's continuing war on the president's signature accomplishment. Do you see, Congresswoman, the majority taking any action to modify or eliminate the sequester or even acknowledge the suffering it's caused?
No, I am very sad to say I don't. And so if we vote again on health care reform, I think it'll be the 38th or 39th time. We need to stop this ritual. Health care reform is not